It's my great honor to be introducing David Grusky, which is professor at Stanford University, professor of sociology, and the director of the Center on Poverty and Inequality. Previously, he was a professor at Cornell University, which is also on a hill. It was also a bit difficult. I remember cycling on the top of the hill was difficult. He was a recipient of the Max Flipper Award in 2004, so it's very much appropriate for him to come here and give us a lecture. He's the author of many books which are referenced in sociology. I remember studying his social stratification book, and more recently he wrote a book, Inequality in the 21st Century. So it's really great pleasure for me to, as a sociologist, to be introducing him, and he's going to be talking to us about data and if scholars should own data. So David, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that nice introduction. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. I'll get right to it. What I'm going to talk about today is the future of big science, and in particular, the future of big science within the context of the field of sociology. And we often think of big social science as the rise of big social science as an inevitable development, but in fact there are several subfields, at least within sociology, where there's been some resistance to that rise. The rise has been stymied. And the questions that I want to ask are three. First, just a descriptive question: in which fields is the rise of big science stymied? Then there's the causal question: why is it stymied in those fields? And then thirdly, more of a normative question: should we be troubled by those holdout zones, or should we celebrate this resistance to big science? So before I get to those questions, I want to talk a bit about how we might think through this transition to big science, at least within sociology. And I think it's useful to think of the point from which big science rose as being a particular mode of production that you might call cottage industry. And there are four features of cottage industry in general when one defines it. I think you can use that same definition to understand what's happening within scientific production in sociology. First off, it's low capitalization. So in particular, the data sets that are, as it really means of scientific production within say, sociology, they're pretty cheap in this cottage mode form. It doesn't cost much to build them. These data sets are privately owned, rather than being seen as a public good, owned by the scholars who collect them. They're pretty simple in the sense that they're targeted to answering a very simple question, not a whole grouping of questions, but just one question. And then the division of labor that's used to produce the research is usually also very simple, and in particular doesn't have a distinction between the data collector and the person who analyzes the data, usually the same person. Okay, so let me give you one example of how this transition unfolds within a field with which I'm familiar, namely that of social mobility. We might think about, say, a century ago, when one of the most famous scholars of social mobility was Sorokin. Think about how he carried out his research as against how mobility research is carried out now. So he's standing in for cottage industry. He represents the cottage industry mode. We'll talk about the rise of big science in the present day. So first off, capital intensivity, very, very low in Sorokin's time when he wrote his famous book, Social Mobility. It didn't cost much for him to put together the data set that was behind that book. very cheap. Whereas by contrast, the data sets that we now use to study social mobility are pretty expensive propositions to assemble. Something like the panel study of income dynamics, or the national longitudinal studies, survey of income program participation, or administratively as well, all expensive things to assemble. As regards ownership, Sorokin pretty much owned the data set that he collected. It was for his use exclusively, whereas by contrast, we now have data sets that are seen as public goods. As regards the generality of use, Sorokin's data set was pretty much targeted to answer the one question with which he was fascinated, namely whether mobility rates fluctuated tremendously or not. Couldn't do much with those data besides address that question, whereas by contrast, the data set that we now have to take on the study of mobility take a multi-purpose omnibus form in which hundreds and hundreds of questions about the structure of social mobility can be answered with those data sets. And then finally, very simple division of labor. When Sorokin undertook this study, it was basically just a one-person operation, whereas now analysts of social, or the research projects in which you're analyzing social mobility often entail a very complicated division of labor, and in particular, the data collectors are distinct from the data analysts. Okay, so here's my claim. The transition out of this cottage industry mode of production is happening across sociology, except in some holdout fields. Holdout fields that I'll talk about subsequently. So how did this transition play out in the US? It's mainly about money. And more money being available to support research. It happened after World War II. There was a ramp up, a Cold War-based ramp up in the amount of funding available to social science and sociology. We had this time the formation of the National Science Foundation, extramural research program from the National Institutes of Health, need for nonprofit funding. All of this made it possible, in particular, to outsource data collection and build these big omnibus data sets. Data sets that were seen as public goods rather than owned by particular scholars, and data sets that were seen as requiring, or scenes in which there's an obligation to serve the needs of the whole bevy of researchers rather than just a particular researcher. They're omnibus multi-purpose data sets. If they're publicly funded, the data sets are publicly funded, then you should serve that larger public. So why was public funding made available? In part, it was because the standards by which we judged good science had changed, and those standards required a more capital-intensive approach. So we thought, for example, it was very important to have representative samples. Those don't come cheaply. It's expensive to collect a data set that's representative, and hence public funding was needed to meet what was seen as that new requirement for high-quality science. Likewise, what we would now call open science doesn't come cheaply. If you want to have transparent methods, capacities for reanalysis, these are expensive propositions and require more funding to realize them. It's exactly the same dynamic as obtaining in the natural sciences. What was seen as high-quality science required a more substantial investment. It's that simple. And then there's an efficiency dynamic. It's more cost-effective to collect a single data set that will serve many people than to ask each analyst to collect data for themselves. It's just an economy of scale issue. So those are all reasons that would make one cheer on big science, right? Who's opposed to efficiency? We all want more efficient data collection that seizes on economies of scale. We all want to be able to meet the demands for higher quality science. It's all good, right? There's one downside, though, that you might want that's worth noting here, and that's that the rise of these omnibus data sets do have a concentrative effect, and you might worry about that. What do I mean by a concentrative effect? Well, you can calculate just an old-fashioned concentration ratio, right? So in this context, you might ask, for example, what share of all the books or articles in a field are produced by, say, the top 4 data sets, right? You can use fancier indices, but this gives you a sense of what I'm talking about here. So if, just as an illustration, if, say, 25% of all US mobility articles were written with tax data, another 20% were written with linked census data, 15% with the survey of income and program participation, and another 10% with the national longitudinal survey, then the concentration ratio would be 70, meaning that those 4 data sets account for 70% of all production in this field. Pretty concentrated, right? Now you might worry about that level of concentration. You might think that has a downside, because if we're doing all of our analysis and reanalysis with just a small number of data sets, it might cut off your opportunities for discovery of new phenomena that would require new, different types of data sets. So you might then conjecture, seems reasonable, that in any given field there's some sort of optimizing mix of these big omnibus public data sets that allow for a lot of reanalysis and accumulation, and then also some amount of innovation that comes by way of new scholar-driven data sets being added to the mix. So you might worry within a lot of quantitative fields that as we get more, say, linked administrative data, as we rely more on tax data, that the concentration level is getting too high and innovation is being cut off. You might have that worry. You might think we're getting too concentrated, or that we're moving to a zone in which that worry might emerge. But in other fields, you might worry to the contrary, that they're under-concentrated. And I want to turn to that worry. And that's going to be the focus of what I'll be discussing here. So here's the argument. The immersive interviewing field is the poster child example of a holdout field that's overcommitted to the cottage industry form. So what do I mean by immersive interviewing? These are just semi-structured conversations that allow people's voices to be directly heard. In an example that I'll share with you later, we lead off with a very disarming question. Tell me the story of your life. This can lead to as much as an hour of conversation in which people relate the arc of their life, and then you might follow up with prompts that guide the conversation to further discussions of family, what's general, and so forth. This type of data collection and analysis has been the foundation for all sorts of very influential books, some of which I've listed here. They only scratch the surface of the amount of work that falls into this general style of immersive conversations. So this field, that I'll talk about this more, is basically a cottage industry field. As I said, this is where big science has been stymied, and you might ask me, why is that? And the argument that I want to put forward is that basically it's undercapitalized. Let me lay that case out. So when I talked about the post-war funding of social science leading to the development of big science, within at least much of sociology, an early version of big science, it wasn't quite right, because that money that emerged during the post-war period and during the Cold War went to one particular style of sociology, namely quantitative sociology. It was used then to build these public good data sets, these public good quantitative data sets, that then led to increasing concentration with a small number of heavily used secondary analysis data sets. So that all happened with quantitative data sets, but on the qualitative side, say the immersive interviewing side, they weren't getting any of that money, right? The reason being that the natural science model was, of course, dominant, and we wanted to fund those types of research that were seen as most similar to natural science, and that was quantitative social science, not qualitative. So qualitative was cut off, and it remained mired, if you will, in the cottage industry form. No funding, no capitalization, and so each scholar was left to collect their own data. And we had, in effect, as many data sets as there were studies. And that's essentially the form that we still now have. Now you might say, well, we should care. What's the problem? What's wrong with your meeting the cottage industry field? And I think the problem, the main problem, is that insofar as you're committed to open science, representativeness, transparency, replicability, it's hard to achieve that with the cottage industry setup. So that's what you're sacrificing. Now you may say, I'm all good with that sacrifice, but we should just be clear over what that sacrifice is. Let me discuss now how it's difficult to meet those open science commitments, representativeness, transparency, replicability, when you're working within the cottage industry forum. There are direct effects of this undercapitalization and indirect effects. Let me start with the direct effects. And it's really quite simple. If you don't have much money with which to collect data, you're probably going to have a small sample size, right? You just don't have enough money to have a larger sample. So that's indeed the case. Immersive interviewing studies are typically based on a relatively small number of cases, small number of interviews. It's a pretty expensive per interview basis, and people can't afford that for self-funding. Likewise, you're probably going to turn to an unrepresentative sample because it's costly to do a representative sample, and you don't have the money. So it's going to be small and unrepresentative. That's the standard form within immersive interviewing field. Then there's an indirect effect, what I'm calling the indirect privatization effect. And the basic deal that's cut within the immersive interviewing field is that you have to incentivize data collection in some fashion, right? There's no money there. So you've got to get individual scholars to get out there and collect the data for their own studies. And if you do that, you incentivize it by giving them ownership rights over the data they collect. And so once you own the data, of course then you're going to narrowly target your data sets to the research questions that you seek to answer with your own particular study. You're not going to serve other researchers. You own the data. It's being collected for your purposes. And so it's going to address your own private interests. And that then means that the data sets that are collected, not just that they're owned by the data collectors, but they're going to be of limited use for other scholars because they're so narrowly targeted to the particular scholar's questions of interest. This is very different than, say, the typical omnibus multi-purpose quantitative data set, where you have a bevy of variables covering a wide range of domains, think the general social survey, for example. And they allow for discoveries of a cross-domain sort. Discoveries that were never anticipated by the people who were collecting the data. They just collected lots and lots of variables, and then good things can happen to the discoveries that very rich data set can enable. Very different with the cottage industry form, because the individual scholars aren't trying to serve the public good in that same way. They're trying to complete their own studies with very limited resources. So the implication is that the cottage industry form undermines open science commitments through both these direct and indirect effects. So maybe you're still not convinced of that last claim. So I want to walk you through a thought experiment. What I want to do is reimpose, at least through thought, reimpose the cottage industry form on the quantitative field, the field that has turned in large part to public use data sets. Let's try to rebuild the cottage industry form within that field. Well, what you could do, for example, is instead of giving the $8 billion that it takes to field the general social survey, take that $8 billion, don't give it to the National Opinion Research Center to go out there and collect those data, but instead divide it up across the 10,000 users of the general social survey and give each of them $800. So you're distributing the $8 billion by 10,000 users, each gets 800, say, go get your own data with your $800. What are you going to do? These are quantitative researchers who use the GSS. Well, first off, you don't need $800. It's going to be a small sample size, right? can't afford it anymore, it's going to probably be an unrepresentative sample because it's just too expensive for $800 to have a representative sample. You're probably going to build a data set that's narrowly targeted, right, to your own particular research questions. You only have $800, right? That's the best you can do. Figure out what your question is, try to make a score on that question. And that, of course, means that the resulting data sets would be of limited interest to other people because it's narrowly targeted to the scholar's own interests, and that topic is going to be well covered by the analysis of that scholar and other things. So what we've just done is reestablish a cottage industry mode of production within the quantitative field. You do it just by limiting restrictions, right? And then you'll get on the natural get exactly what you already have now within the qualitative field. So I'm emphasizing, if you will, a materialist account, right? It's just about the money. But there is, of course, also some cultural effects, obviously, at play. And I want to talk about those cultural effects in the context of qualitative journalism, because it's an especially easy case to make. So, at least in the US, qualitative journalism is a growth industry. I'm an avid consumer of it. If you go to the New York Times, there's often going to be a piece of qualitative journalism. You all know the form. It starts off with a particular individual case, and you relate the features of that case, so then the writer of the piece goes on to make the general point that that case is supposed to illustrate. Interview a few people that bring color, as it were, to the argument that's being made. So, it's a convenient sample, there's no transparency, there's no commitment to secondary analysis, it's not kind of an open science process at all, that's just qualitative journalism. Now, why is it practiced that way? In part, the whole concept of reproducibility, and this is where the culture part of it has come into play. The concept of reproducibility within qualitative journalism is very different than the open science concept of reproducibility. What does a journalist mean by reproducibility? It means if you go back to the person that they interviewed and say, hey, did you really say this? They'd say, yeah, I said that. That's the score. That's reproducibility, right? It just means that you can go back to that person, and it's really an existence proof, right? Just as there's at least one person out there in the world who illustrates the larger point that the journalist is trying to make. That's reproducibility for them, but it's not reproducibility for the typical scientist, or at least for someone who subscribes to open science commitments, because what is meant within that context is a comment about the central tendency, right? We want to make sure what this one person said isn't just what one person is experiencing, but it characterizes a population in a more general way. That's what we want from this study. When we read the studies in the New York Times and other outlets, that's what we're thinking we're getting. We don't really care about the one person, we care about the larger claim about what's happening in the world. But that's really not the kind of the reproducibility that journalists think is important. The same sort of conclusion holds with respect to the immersive interview field within academia. It also has anti-open science sentiments. And we can talk about this more, I'm going to have to move on, but I suspect that those sentiments in part are all about making a virtue of necessity. And if you don't have any money, you're going to celebrate the types of analyses that you can do given those constraints. But whatever the causes may be, if it's undercapitalization, if there's some cultural commitments in play, I do think it's clear that the open science problem is immersive interviewing's biggest challenge. Whenever you get a critique of immersive interviewing, and there's lots, it almost invariably focuses on open science problems. So there are worries about the lack of transparency, about no opportunities for secondary analysis, about unrepresented or convenient samples. These types of concerns come up again and again. And because there's such a history of criticism of this form, it's never been seen as sufficiently scientific, those who practice this will, of course, dig in. Of course they would. They dig in, and it makes it difficult then for this particular style of research to evolve in ways that one might want. We're frozen in time. So this is all to say that there should be a room for loyal criticism, for recognizing how important and powerful immersive interviewing is, and therefore wanting to build a second form of it that stands alongside the cottage industry form. Now, why would you want to commit to that second form of open science immersive interviewing? It's because the payoff of immersive interviewing is substantial. There are two key advantages that one gets out of immersive interviewing that really can't be secured, I would argue, through surveys. First is it may well be the best approach for directly hearing the voices of the people and ferreting out what they're thinking, doing, and feeling. Far better, one might argue, than a forced choice survey in which the person designing the survey thinks they know what the right questions are to ask, and then forces the answers to fall within very circumscribed categories. So it's a great way to listen and understand what people are thinking, doing, and feeling. And then secondarily, it's a great crisis detection device, and may well be the best approach for detecting new crises before it's too late. I would say social science's record in this regard is not wonderful. A lot of crises were detected only too late. And I would say it's in part because we didn't have a device of this sort for listening to the voices of the people. We detected the opioid crisis way too late, before lots of carnage was already in play. We detected the rise of populism way too late. And if we had a device for listening to people, we might have been able to do a better job of it. So we need immersive interviewing. We need more of it. And we need to capitalize it in the way that we capitalize quantitative research. Especially so, I would argue, in a crisis-rich century, when we're going to have a lot of crises coming down the pike, and we need to understand what's happening before there's carnage, and hopefully be able to do something about it. Okay, so I'm going to summarize where I am to this point in the argument. And I'm going to check where I am. Okay. So here's where we are to this point. Qualitative work is immensely influential and valuable, but it faces troubling open science problems, both its scholarly and journalistic variants. And the source of the problem is undercapitalization and the constant persistence of the cottage industry form. I spent 30 minutes making those simple points. Okay. So if undercapitalization is the problem, then we need to capitalize. We need to fund a new type of qualitative immersive interviewing. We need to do so by diverting some public funds to that form and building a second brand of immersive interviewing that's based on a public data set and that stands alongside the current cottage industry form. And I think it's kind of shocking that we have dozens and dozens of public use quantitative data sets, all immensely valuable, funded principally by public funding agencies, like the General Social Survey, the Current Population Survey, the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, the American National Election Study, the Consumer Expenditure Survey, the National Longitudinal Survey, Survey of Consumer Finances, National Educational Longitudinal Study, Survey of Income and Program Participation, on and on and on and on, right? Very valuable. I'm not quibbling with the importance of funding these data sets, but we might think about having at least one publicly funded immersive interviewing study.
Can I just ask you a question?
Yes.
So does the data set that are produced, for instance, Matthew Desmond in his books, can other researchers use the interview? Do qualitative researchers in the US release the interview or not? Because I know that in the UK they do.
They often do.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about that, because that's a great question. Let me allocate that really soon, because you might think that archiving and reanalysis is the answer.
Mm-hmm.
But see if I address that adequately. Because yes, they often do. They're not obliged to, but they are. Oh, here we go. Thank you. So there might be a shortcut. I'm saying we have to build a public use data set. But the alternative is we just take the data sets that qualitative researchers are currently collecting and put them into an archive and open them up for broader use. Let's think about that a bit. This is a very conventional way to try to bring an open science sensibility to the qualitative world. Archiving initiatives, there are many data repositories, qualitative data repositories. I think they're great, but I don't think they're the full and complete answer. Why not? I want to do another thought experiment. Let's go back to that general social survey thought experiment. Remember, we took the $8 million it takes to deliver the general social survey, we split it across the 10,000 users, each got 800, each carried out their own study, narrowly targeted to their own research interest, like, say, prediction. But let's say now someone says, well, I want to do it in an open science form. So I'm going to mandate that each of those 10,000 studies get archived. What happens? Well, the studies are still small. They're still underrepresented. They're still narrowly targeted and incommensurable. And so when you reassemble your 10,000 studies, you don't have the general social survey now. You have 10,000 incommensurable studies, usually based on opinion samples, usually not representative. So that's a sense in which the whole is not any greater than the sum of the parts. You just got them all now and stuff into an archive. But no one really wants to analyze those data sets because they're so narrowly targeted. You can replicate someone's study, and that is valuable, but it's not going to give you the opportunities to make discoveries by having these big public use data sets in which you can make connections across different domains. Connections, say, between one's eviction experiences and perhaps the way in which you receive safety net support, or your connections to other family members, or the kinds of neighborhoods you live in, the segregation within those neighborhoods. All sorts of other things are happening at the same time. And an omnibus data set will allow you to examine eviction within the context of this entire part of your life. We'll see if you're satisfied. Now I'm really remember how to do it, but it's a great question.
I mean, you're not simply talking about having massive qualitative interviews with a big data set, like for instance the British cohort 70 have released interviews, long qualitative interview that you can directly analyze with the British cohort. Are you talking about something like that?
Yes, something like that. If it's indeed representative, if it's not like, oh, are you okay with being interviewed, and then a very small self-selected group of folks, then great. That would then be problematic. But if indeed everyone was interviewed, then that could possibly be the answer. We don't have something like that in the US.
Mm-hmm. But that exists, for instance, that case. Mm-hmm.
So, it would be hard for that kind of data set, a public use qualitative data set. In the US, there is now a trial public use data set that's available. We're in the midst of an experiment to see if there's payoff to this public use form, and so I want to talk about that now. So it's the American Voices Project is the name. Here, it's a big group of folks. I'm just one of them who's behind this initiative. Here's some of the people who are involved. Also many organizational partners. A coalition of Federal Reserve banks was behind this initiative, and of course many foundations. So our mission is very consistent with what I just laid out here. We started with a simple question: if open science were our North Star, how would a new public qualitative data set be configured around that commitment? Let me talk a bit about how we proceeded in light of that North Star. I'll give you a summary of the APP, American Voices Project Basic Features, 7 quick slides. 2,700 face-to-face and telephone interviews. The telephone interviews started during the pandemic. We began with face-to-face. It's the largest representative omnibus qualitative study in the US. Representative samples of the US, 2-stage design that allows you to generalize both to different types of neighborhoods and also to the US as a whole. Semi-structured, long-form conversations. The opening prompt is tell me the story of your life. That would often lead to as much as an hour discussion of the arc of their life, and then it would be followed up with other prompts that speak to other domains within your life. Most of these conversations involve a very high level of engagement, often characterized as cathartic. People appreciate being listened to. It's really the antithesis, as I see it, of the survey experience, at least for me, when I'm engaging in this survey, there's only one question always on my mind: when will the pain end? And that is not the mental experience of someone who participates in an immersive interview. As I said, it covers the main life domains, a holistic view of everyday life, prompts about the story of your family life, your job, your health, your political views, your religious views, and more. It's an individual level mixed methods design. It includes a short survey after the immersive interview, and then you're asked to give consent to administrative data. Very short follow-up surveys delivered 6 months after the initial interview. And there'll be an ongoing stream of administrative data as well, for those who consented to it. And then these de-identified data are made available to qualified researchers on secure servers with disclosure review. So that's it. Now the real work begins after the data are delivered, or after the data are collected, and so I want to talk a bit about those next steps. Talk a bit about protecting confidentiality and how that's done. And then our trial stage public analyses, and then the full-on public analyses. Let me just talk about those now. The confidentiality issue is of course critical. Why hasn't there been a large-scale public qualitative data set in the United States until now? And the standard claim is confidentiality can't be protected. But we've used basically the same procedure that's used for guaranteeing confidentiality within quantitative data set. It's begins with de-identification, we vet proposals and researchers. It happens, all the analysis happens in a secure computing environment. It's very similar to the Federal Statistical Research Data Centers in the US for quantitative data. And then we engage in disclosure avoidance review before anything is released to the public. We do our best to ensure that nothing that would be identified would go through that process and be released. So now we're in the public analysis trial period, which has 3 components to it. I'll talk about those briefly. So first off, we did some internal reports to experiment with real-time monitoring. We had to revamp as the pandemic broke out into remote interviewing form, and our foundation sponsors, particularly Gates, wanted us to do real-time monitoring of the pandemic as it unfolded. We didn't want to wait to do normal science, but it was it was too important to get reports out instantly, so we did our best to do that. We have reports on mental health problems among adolescents, coping during the pandemic, public reactions to the safety net supports during the pandemic, the anti-vax movement, the noxious contracts that emerged when when suddenly people were exposed to risks that they hadn't signed up for. The racial divide and discourse in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter protests, real-time reactions to the storming of the Capitol, counter the pandemic, and more. Lots of these crisis reports were useful for showing how this type of instrument could be used for monitoring crises as they unfold and trying to detect new crises. Now we're partnering with the Russell Sage Foundation to do trial public releases. There's a upcoming issue of the Russell Sage Foundation Journal, which about 15 studies will appear all around the general idea of how Americans are living in perpetual crisis, crisis in the work world, how they now understand and interpret the crises that are in play, and deprivation and violence in this world. We've had one conference with initial presentations of these papers. There's a lot of applications to participate in this trial. It's the second highest number of applications ever to a Russell Sage Foundation call. We were committed to incorporating scholars who don't always have access to immersive interviewing because they don't have the support at their institutions to undertake immersive interview studies. So we tried to include as many as many graduate students and people from less resourced institutions in this initial tranche. But lots of people couldn't be supported, so we then had a second tranche of folks who also wanted to be part of this initiative. So another 25 research teams are now participating as well. And the idea is that all of these various users are mandated to help us so that we can prepare for a full-blown public release that will be happening at this time. So what kind of research are they doing? I'll just briefly review that and then we'll be done. First off, there's a lot of studies that are putting to test some of the critical claims that have come out of immersive interviewing. Claims that are based not on representative samples, but based on convenience samples, with often very small n, so you might want to put them to test in representative samples with larger n, and so we have a lot of this accumulation work underway. An important function, I think, for this kind of data set. Very exciting discoveries can come out of convenience samples and so forth, but then you might want to subject them to test through representative samples. A lot of crisis reporting, understanding how the current crises are unfolding, loneliness crisis and many others. A lot of discovery work. People are trying to figure out if there are new crises underway, something like today's opioid crisis that we aren't appreciative of, and they can come out of this kind of immersive interviewing. A lot of intersectional work. When you have an N as large as we have, you can carry out analyses with more intersections, if you will, of critical identities than is typically the case with comparison groups. And then there's some, what I'm calling here, conventional mixed methods adornment work. This is an often the way in which immersive interviewing is used. You're basically doing a quantitative study, you want to bring it to life in the way that, say, journalists bring to life their stories by featuring interviews. It's a way to do it, as it were, on the cheap. Instead of doing your own immersive interview and study in conjunction with your quantitative study, you can just go to the American Voices Project and get what I'm calling here, maybe sounds a bit disparaging, but window dressing quotes that make the results come alive. But at least you're being held to the standard that these are representative and not just window dressing. So it's really not fair to debate. So that's just some of the research that's happening. I'm going to give you just two more illustrative examples of how these data are being used. First off, there's a fair amount of work on monitoring attitudes using these data. So you think about how we conventionally monitor attitudes through surveys. we basically directly ask respondents to self-report on their attitudes, right? We surgically extract them. And that presupposes that they know their attitudes, that they can access them, and they're going to faithfully report them. So an alternative conversational approach is you use, say, natural language processing or conventional immersive interviewing analysis techniques to monitor trends in attitudes as they emerge organically in conversations. Has the potential to eliminate social desirability effects. Now, of course, there's a long history of natural language processing-based analyses of sentiments, right? But the advantage of carrying out those analyses within, say, the American Voices Project is that it controls for context. Everyone's putatively subjected to the same context. Whereas by contrast, if you use social media, you have a very disparate set of contexts that make it more difficult to understand the conversations that unfold. And also it eliminates selection of platform effects. The second type of research I think is of interest, and I want to just talk about briefly, is using the American Voices Project for prediction, either predicting the follow-up survey responses or predicting responses that come out of administrative data. And there's some work underway using the American Voices Project for that objective. And kind of the starting point here is that we've had only limited success in developing predictive models of individual level poverty. So for example, Kat Lee and others have tried to use fractal family survey to predict who falls into poverty, and they haven't been all that successful. It's hard to do it, even using machine learning. Hence a large complement of interactions between a large number of variables that are available in the fractal family data set. Even with all of that firepower, as it were, they found it difficult. In this case, this isn't the case in other studies, but found it difficult to predict who is going to become poor. And so the possibility is that when you have the more holistic data, the arc of life, immersive interview data at your disposal, you'll be getting a much richer characterization of people's starting points, the challenges that they're facing, and that you'll be able then, on the basis of those data, to make predictions that just aren't possible with conventional survey data. And why would one want that? Well, if we don't know what generates poverty at the individual level, it becomes very difficult to target resources in the systems, those people who are likely to fall into poverty. So there's a payoff to being able to predict who's at risk. So my admittedly positional bias conclusion is that there's lots of positive results coming out showing that there's a high demand for an omnibus qualitative data set of this sort, and it opens up very productive avenues of research. And so then the claim again is that we ought to have at least one publicly funded immersive interviewing platform that will allow us to be permanently in the field and carry out studies of this sort. So we're actually now building that permanent infrastructure. This was just a one-off experiment, and now we're turning to what we're calling ADP 2.0. A permanent immersive interviewing infrastructure that capitalizes on what we've learned. And then also, we're just starting up also a worldwide voices project with the idea being to carry out studies of this sort in a variety of different countries that could then be compared to one another. Let me talk a bit about that, and then I will be done. So, this ADP 2.0 will hopefully be based on the National Science Foundation infrastructure funding and a new partnership with the National Opinion Research Center, which is the home of the General Social Survey, so it's a very natural partner. 5 innovations that I'll just briefly talk about that make us move beyond ADP 1.0 and provide a foundation for a strong, permanent infrastructure. First innovation, what we learned from the pandemic. Remember, we started out as face-to-face interviewing. Pandemic hits, we had to pull all of our interviewers who are in the field, we had to pull them. And we on the fly, developed a remote interviewing infrastructure. A lot of experiments very close to reproducing the authenticity, the immersiveness of a face-to-face interview, but now remotely and at a much lower cost, which is important. Whether or not we can make this happen is going to depend on money. And remote interviewing innovation allows us to save quite a bit of money and makes it more likely to happen. AI-based transcription, sounds boring, but another big cost is transcription. Also slows us down. If we want to do real-time reporting, having instantaneous transcription is very important in AI. Recent advances in AI make it possible. It really pretty much changes everything. We have never been able to make automated transcription work successfully, but now it can. Very low cost, instantaneous, very high quality. We're working really hard on the continuous monitoring side. Having AI-based transcription helps a lot, of course, but other interventions are also useful in order to really realize this commitment to developing a new type of journalism in which immensely important. It's our lens into what's happening in the world right now, but we want a lens that's based on representative samples. So this ADP 2.0 will hopefully deliver on that commitment. We'll have a sampling frame that generates nationally representative samples every month. New interview prompts will be developed instantly in response to key events, like the storming of the Capitol. The interviews will represent the views of a cross-section of the country, not small convenient samples. Qualified journalists will be given access to the data. We hope that they'll use it. If they don't, we're going to have a team of very good journalists who will stand at the ready. So if the New York Times puts out a piece based on what's happening in the next crisis that's based on a convenient sample, we're going to go to our representative data and see if indeed what they said was right. And we hope if we do that enough, they might start using the data instead of just using convenient samples. So it's a new type of real-time monitoring that hopefully we can trust. Innovation 4, follow-up interviews. One of the big criticisms, and I think it's totally on the mark, is that ADP 1.0 didn't allow for follow-up interviews. So you discover something amazing that seems to be coming out of the data, and ordinarily in conventional immersive interviewing, the data collector would be right there seeing it happen and saying, I'm going to follow up by changing my prompts. I'm going to go back to the field and study what seems to have emerged. We've talked about this problem with the National Opinion Research Center, and we're going to be able to allow follow-up interviews. So if you're doing your secondary analysis of ADP 2.0, and you say, something's happening here that I need to follow up on right now, NRC will make that possible because they're empaneled diversity. Interviewees will have consented to re-interview. You'll be able to get a representative sample and follow up. And so instead of doing, so you're going to do your own sort of bespoke interviewing, but only to the extent that you need to. When you can draw upon the existing study, great. If you need to do more, you can do that too. And then finally, a new qualitative methods lab. I'll skip over that. I want to get to the end. I talked about the cross-national initiative already. And my conclusion, I want you to imagine a world in which quantitative scholars had to collect their own data. So it's a world without a census, a world without surveys, a world without administrative data. It's an individualized, no public goods world in which every scientist collects their own data, publishes them, and then throws the data away. Sometimes they work. That's the world in which qualitative researchers live. And so it seems extraordinary that qualitative researchers are taken to task for not meeting open science commitments when they're not given the main tool, namely the public use data set that allows you to meet open science commitments. So we need to build that tool. We rely heavily on qualitative data, but we do it on the cheap. So it's time to recognize that we rely on qualitative data and fund the form accordingly.